Welcome to fairy tale class, and in this class we're going to learn today some of the elements of fairy tales. And our objective is by the end of this week you'll be able to identify and recall key details from a selection of fairy tales by different authors, most notably the Big Three, Charles Perrault, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, and Hans Christian Andersen. And then by the end of this segment you'll be able to create a short list of fairy tales to explore further. Start thinking about what tales you might want to use for your final project and be able to identify some common markers in fairy tales. But before we get into all of that, what is a fairy tale anyway? After all of these years of reading them and learning about them, I can't give a neat and tidy answer to that. And I haven't found anybody that still really can. But I know one when I read one. Do you? Oftentimes my students will bring up Disney films like Pinocchio or even Moana. Those aren't fairy tales. So to understand what a fairy tale is, we got to know what folklore is, because folklore is the genre where fairy tales come from. And folklore is generally a body of popular myths or stories or beliefs, spread usually verbally uh, within a group or a populace. So if we have folklore as our genre, we've got three subgenres: myths, legends, and fairy tales. Myths, as you might recall, generally feature deities, gods, goddesses, and their relationship to the natural order, to human beings. Legends are stories that might have a grain of truth and might have been true at one time, but with all the retellings, they've taken on a life of their own. And fairy tales are stories that have certain markers, most notably magical elements, flat characters, and a moral. There's usually always a moral to the story in fairy tales. They were usually spoken and shared before they were written down, so it's really hard to track down the earliest fairy tales. And they were so spoken and shared that some fairy tales are found with so many variations in many different cultures. And an example of this would be Cinderella. And as early as the year 1892, Marian Roalfe Cox was able to compile 345 variations of Cinderella. Now, that's just within the European region alone, because Cinderella has made its way through all kinds of cultures, far extending outside of Europe. So one of the qualities of the fairy tale is that you have pretty flat characters, meaning the evil characters are just pretty evil and bad, and the good ones are good. You're not going to find redeeming qualities or stories of redemption or maybe a little tiny speck of good in an evil character in a fairy tale. They're just generally bad. And likewise for the good. Good characters might make mistakes because they are gullible or innocent, and that might be the problem of the story. Their gullibility might lead them into trouble, but generally they're pretty good. Some of the qualities we find throughout the body of fairy tales that protagonists share, they might be unwanted, like Hansel and Gretel, or they might be disregarded, like Cinderella. They might be dependent, like Rapunzel. They might be inwardly good and innocent, and they usually find success with help from an outside source and a dash of boldness on their own part. If you can think of, again, Cinderella, people often comment on how she was very helpless, and in some versions she does appear quite helpless, quite more so than others. But you gotta admit, it did take a dash of boldness to get out of that house and to get herself to the ball at the Grand Palace. So boldness is kind of a key. Now, conversely, the antagonists, they just tend to be evil. They're pretty bad. They serve the role of pushing the character, the protagonist, to make a moral decision and to display some resilience. They often reflect the worst of society's fears at the time. Now, there is a little group of fairy tales that this doesn't apply to, and that would be your trickster tales. An example of this trickster tale would be Jack and the Beanstalk. You can't really say he's a good guy. Jack breaks and enters into someone's house, steals their belongings, and kills the owner of the house. Now, the giant was a pretty bad guy to begin with, but stories that feature protagonists like Jack are generally known as trickster because the protagonist is admired for being cunning and clever in a situation that started off being pretty bad to begin with. So that's the exception. Other qualities of fairy tales include magical helpers, magical elements in the fairy tale, and animals with abilities either to talk or the goose that laid the golden egg didn't talk, but she performed some magic, that brought value to whoever had her. So those three things be on the lookout. And speaking of three, the number three shows up time and time again in fairy tales. We've got the three bears, the three pigs, although there's four pigs in this picture. I'm assuming one of those is his mom. The three billy goats gruff. And of course, three is prominent in one of my favorite tales, the three wishes. And this is an interesting result of one of those three wishes. The wife gets a sausage stuck on the end of her nose. So the person who's known as the father of fairy tales is Charles Perrault, and he was alive and wrote and most active in the 17th century in France. He was born to a wealthy family. He was the seventh child in that family. He went to great schools, he got a great education, and he studied the law, and he embarked on a career in government service. He wanted to be just like his father and his older brother Jean. But there was a secret writer in Charles Perrault. And in his years of government service, he also wrote things like histories and epic poetry before finally trying his hand at children's literature. He eventually lost his place in the government, and he took that time then. He collected some of his tales and rewrote them, refigured them himself. Some of the tales he actually wrote himself, and he published them in a book called Mother Goose Tales. Now, this book was wildly popular, and it went through a lot of different publications in his lifetime alone. And some of the tales in here were The Sleeping Beauty, Bluebeard, which is one of my favorite, Little Red Riding Hood, and of course, Cinderella. And it was Charles Perrault's Cinderella that Walt Disney based his cartoon Cinderella on. Next, there is Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, and they came after Charles Perrault. They took from some of his tales and they took a lot from the populace around them. They traveled far and wide into the countryside, into the forest, into the poor areas. And that's where they got their fairy tales. So they didn't actually write any of their fairy tales. However, they wrote them down. So they collected the fairy tales and wrote them down. And since they got their tales from the populace in the poorer areas where the living was a lot harder, that reflects in the content of the fairy tales that you will look at from the Grimm brothers. And if you can just remember their name, Grimm, it's a great way of remembering that the Grimm brother fairy tales are actually grim. They are bloody, often violent, often scary and dark, and display adult themes that we would never dream of sharing with kids. In fact, their first book wasn't really even published for children at all. It came with footnotes, and it really just was made for adults. And some of the fairy tales that they're known for are Rapunzel, Rumpelstiltskin, the Frog Prince, the Goose Girl, Hansel and Gretel, and of course, their bloodier version of Cinderella, Ashpuddle. And these are the stepsisters in Ashpuddle. They get their eyes picked out. And then last but not least, we have Hans Christian Andersen, and he has also written some of the fairy tales that I think you're going to find you're familiar with. Now, Hans Christian Andersen, his life alone was started kind of like a fairy tale. He was left fatherless at a young age, and he found his fortune as an actor at the age of 14. He might have come in contact with the king and upper class nobility and became in a position of favor with them, but he was never married, and he seemed to be plagued by loneliness all of his life, and he felt different for all of his life. It's thought today that he might have suffered from Marfan syndrome, which can give a person an unusually large or misshapen appearance. And while he lived the life of a Victorian gentleman, um, his writings they can be very dark. And so we think that it was his own life reflected in his fairy tales. Now, he actually wrote his fairy tales. So he is from the modern age, 19th century, and he did not go out and collect his fairy tales. He actually wrote them. So he was a little bit influenced by Perrault and the Grimm brothers. He was a lot influenced by Shakespeare and by Charles Dickens, another writer at the time. And they respected each other's work and their depictions of the poor and the underclass who had difficult lives, um, who lived in abject poverty, whose lives were affected by the Industrial Revolution, and also there was a growing sympathy at the time for children and this idealization of the innocence of children. And that was new. Before that time, people treated children and saw them as either nuisances or little adults. So that was a new idea, and that is often embodied in his work. And the death of a child is a theme that haunted Andersen, and it's depicted very poignantly in The Little Match Girl. He also had The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, The Snow Queen, and The Emperor's New Clothes. Of those, I would say The Emperor's New Clothes is probably as funny as he got. That's a rather funny tale. But the rest of those tales are pretty sad, including The Little Mermaid. So that is our presentation. And make sure that you have submitted your answers to the quiz that is accompanying this presentation. And let's be prepared to discuss what fairy tales are you going to want to read and start collecting for your own studies at this point.